One of the most fascinating and useful things about Jungian psychology is its ability to characterize distinct psychological phenomena in a way that is easy to understand, but which also demonstrates the subtle complexity of the human psyche. Jung realized that many concepts which seem to be exactly the same can be differentiated and described as distinct psychological entities, which form the psyche of a human being. Learning to recognize the fact that people are composed of a network of interacting parts, and that these parts form the structure of the psyche, can help you understand both yourself and other people. Furthermore, understanding these core components of the personality lends the opportunity for psychological growth through a process which Jung termed individuation, and through this process, one can attain psychic harmony. Three concepts which often get mixed up or confused for one another are the persona, the ego, and the self. Oftentimes, people mistake the persona for their ego, or they confuse the ego with the self. And people who are young, or who have not psychologically matured, can often mistake the persona for the self. Jung's system of psychology allows us to differentiate these components, and show that oftentimes, your personality is much more complicated than it seems. The persona represents the social mask we display to others. It is an interface between our internal state and the exterior world. Whenever we interact with someone in a social context, we rarely display the totality of our personality. Rather, we tend only to display a tiny portion of ourselves, and this social mask is often shaped by what is expected of us by others and society. A doctor is expected to have the persona of a doctor, and a teacher is required to act like a teacher. But both these guises are just masks which conceal the real person. The persona is a complicated system of relations between the individual consciousness and society, fittingly enough a kind of mask, designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and, on the other, to conceal the true nature of the individual. That the latter function is superfluous could be maintained only by one who is so identified with his persona that he no longer knows himself, and that the former is unnecessary could only occur to one who is quite unconscious of the true nature of his fellows. Society expects, and indeed must expect, every individual to play the part assigned to him as perfectly as possible. It is common for people to have multiple personas dependent on different social contexts. You may have one persona which you wear professionally, another which you wear with close friends, and another you wear with family members. If you have a strong, trusting relationship with someone, the persona you wear around them may be more reflective of your actual personality. If, on the other hand, you are interacting with someone you don't know very well, your persona will probably be more restricted, and less reflective of your true personality. Although the persona is vital for social interactions, and for society in general, it can lead to neurotic suffering if a person is constantly forced to put on a mask, especially when a person's true personality is repeatedly repressed. If the persona is the mask we wear to disguise ourselves from others, the ego is like the mask we wear to disguise ourselves from ourselves. While the persona is oriented outwards, the ego is oriented inwards, and it is who we think we are. We essentially build up a character based on traits we idealize or recognize as belonging to ourselves. This internal character, which we identify as ourselves, is then what decides our actions. Our internal egos are always speaking and giving directions to follow, creating a narrative around our lives of which we are the main character. We understand the ego as the complex factor to which all conscious contents are related. It forms, as it were, the center of the field of consciousness, and insofar as this comprises the empirical personality, the ego is the subject of all personal acts of consciousness. The relation of a psychic content to the ego forms the criterion of its consciousness, for no content can be conscious unless it is represented to a subject. The ego is the I whenever a personal statement is made, such as I am tired or I dislike him. Distinguishing the persona from the ego may not be immediately obvious, but if you pay attention to how you interact with others, you may be able to notice that there is a difference between the ego and the persona. This is especially apparent when you are interacting with someone who you hold a negative opinion about, but because of the social situation, cannot express this opinion, and instead must wear your persona around them, such as a boss who you need to respect despite your underlying resentment. You may smile and make yourself appear friendly, but your inner mind may be leveling all kinds of insults or expressing your real attitude towards the person. Your outward expressions constitute your persona, but beneath this mask, your actual thoughts, which are known only to you, constitutes your ego. Thus, people can only ever display a small portion of their personality whenever they interact with others, and the true complexity of a person is difficult to fully ascertain, as they may be hiding certain thoughts and opinions as they interact with the world through their persona. Many times, people will think of themselves as their ego, but what we fail to realize is that the ego is something we construct for ourselves, and it often hides a deeper personality, which we sometimes fail to acknowledge or deliberately choose to ignore. The ego comprises the part of the personality of which we are conscious, but oftentimes there is a much larger portion of the personality which is submerged beneath our conscious awareness. This deeper personality is the self, and the self comprises the entirety of a person's psyche, both the parts which they consciously associate with their ego, and the parts which are ignored or repressed. Since the self is the objective totality of a person's psyche, there is almost no way for this entire personality to be captured in consciousness, and large portions of the psyche will always remain unconscious. There is little hope of our ever being able to reach even approximate consciousness of the self, since however much we may make conscious, there will always exist an indeterminate and indeterminable amount of unconscious material which belongs to the totality of the self. Hence, the self will always remain a superordinate quantity. While the ego can be called the seat of subjective personality, i.e. who we believe ourselves to be, the self is the seat of objective personality, i.e. who we really are, irrespective of what we think, and it includes both the ego and our persona, as well as the personal unconscious and the archetypes of the collective unconscious. The goal of individuation, or self-realization, is to integrate portions of the unconscious self into our egos, and to widen our personalities, so that we don't fool ourselves with delusions about who we really are. In other words, it is better to acknowledge the totality of the self, including our negative personality traits, than to remain unconscious of who we really are. Since the self is who we truly are, no good can come from ignoring it or denying its existence. Rather, it is better to recognize the contents of the unconscious as belonging to oneself. The self is an archetype of the entire psyche, and it naturally seeks to solve the psychological problems caused by different parts of the personality conflicting with one another, by unifying the disparate parts of the psyche into a cohesive whole. The self naturally produces symbols which are meant to unify the warring halves of the mind, as whenever we are suffering from an internal conflict, the self attempts to restore psychological balance by reconciling these opposing tendencies. This is why the self is often represented as the union of opposites. Many symbols in mythology represent a return to the self and the union of consciousness with the unconscious. The relationship between these three entities is complicated and tends to differ throughout the course of one's life. When we are very young, there is no ego differentiated from the self, and in a sense, we are absorbed in the self. As rules and restrictions on behavior become imposed by parents or by society, the ego begins to differentiate from the self as a distinct entity. This is called the ego-self axis, as the ego gradually becomes separated from the self. A person will, at this point, think of themselves as their ego, and the ego is essentially identical with the persona. However, as a person matures, their ego and persona will begin to split from each other, as the persona is increasingly utilized for social situations. The persona functions as a mask, which makes our actions and appearance to others socially acceptable, and as a result, we tend to withhold certain parts of our personality for fear of being perceived as different or divergent from the norm. Our ego, that is, who we think we are, begins to function as a personal instrument for actions and thoughts, which we can safely conceal from other people. However, this causes us to be inauthentic to our true selves, and we are effectively slaves to the social norms and expectations of others. This is why Jung believed that it was important to divest oneself from their persona. When we analyze the persona, we strip off the mask, and discovered that what seemed to be individual is at bottom collective. Additionally, it is important to recognize the ego as only a small segment of the psyche, as having an overinflated ego can lead to a sudden and unexpected period of ego deflation and psychic disorientation. Jung described the second half of life as a process of returning to the self as we become more psychologically mature and less egoic. The individuation process occurs naturally as contents of the unconscious press upwards in the form of symbolic images, such as the images we see in dreams. By noting these contents, we can integrate elements of the unconscious into consciousness and be authentic to ourselves. However, not all attempts to make the unconscious conscious lead to positive results. In the future, we will discuss integrating the unconscious in a healthy way that leads to a positive outcome.